Hi, my name's Dave Huxtable and I'm a leadership coach, linguist and polyglot, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some hints and tips about how best to learn a new language. Firstly, I think one of the common misconceptions about language learning is that you somehow need to be some kind of genius, that you need to be born with a special talent for language learning. And, while that doesn't do any harm, it isn't absolutely necessary. So just like, you can learn to be perfectly proficient musician without being Mozart, you can also learn whichever language you want to learn without necessarily being a child genius or an adult genius or a middle-aged genius or a geriatric genius or any other kind of genius. Once you've convinced yourself that you as an ordinary, normal human being are capable of learning a language, the next thing you really need to look at, the question you need to ask yourself next is, why am I learning this language? And people learn languages for all different reasons. So it could be for work, it could be for travel, it could be to spread your religion.
Selamat siang. Pernahkah Anda mendengar kabar baik tentang monster spaghetti terbang?
It could be to meet new friends, or maybe to meet your partner or loved one's family who speaks a different language. But whatever the reason, you need to then look about what the implications of that are. So at this stage, it would be really interesting to hear from you, one, what language you're thinking of learning or are learning at the moment, and why, what's your reason? Put it in the comments below. And your reason for wanting to learn the language will dictate, to a certain extent, how you go about it, what you learn, especially where you start, and some of the other decisions that you have to make about your learning. Now, you may say, when I say, do you want it for work or for travel or for family or for friends, you might say, well, all of those. Well, that's great, but you still need to start somewhere. So if you imagine that, a language and all of the knowledge that entails about the vocabulary and the pronunciation and the writing system and the grammar, all of that is like this massive buffet lunch. You might think, right, in the end, I'm going to eat it all, which I suppose you might, but you've still got to start somewhere. And if you start with the bits that you don't like, or that aren't relevant to you, you're likely to give up. So one of the really big motivators is learning language in a way that works for you, and learning to say those things that you want to say, and learning to understand the things that whatever environment you're going to be practicing the language in, that people are actually going to say to you. That is much, much, much more motivating than learning lists of animals or colours or whatever. Also, depending on your reason for learning the language, you might want to ask yourself, do I want to concentrate on speaking, listening, reading, or writing? And an interesting choice that you might have to make, and that some people don't really realise that is theirs to make, is whether to learn to read and write at all. For some languages, learning the writing system and the written language isn't actually that much of a challenge. So, for example, learning to spell something like Spanish isn't actually that much of a challenge. So, if you're learning to speak, you might as well also learn to send text messages. Other languages are more of a challenge. So, the difference between spoken French and written French, not just because the spelling of French is very conservative. So lots of the letters that are used are for sounds that aren't pronounced anymore, because the writing system was made so long ago. But also the actual difference between the vocabulary and the grammar and the word order of written French as opposed to spoken French are really different. You then get into languages with other writing systems. Now, it's interesting. Some people think that, say, languages that use the Cyrillic alphabet, like Russian, lots of Central Asian languages, some of the languages of the former Yugoslavia, That makes it really, really difficult. Actually, you can learn a new alphabet, especially one like Cyrillic. You can learn it in a couple of days. It's 32 things that you need to learn. Also, with something like Korean, Hangeul, it's quite systematic. It doesn't take a great deal of mental energy to learn it. And at least, if you go to Korea, you can read street signs and the occasional poster. Maybe, learning enough written Korean to understand great literature or to write is more of a challenge. Then you get to things like Chinese and Japanese, where learning the written language is a whole endeavor on its own. And you really need to ask yourself, is it worth my while? You'll sometimes need to dig deeper into your answer to some of those questions. So if you say, for example, I'm learning this language for work, what does that actually mean? Will you be having meetings in it? Will you be actually conducting negotiation in it? Is it for sending and receiving emails? Or is it, and is often the case, for making small talk and actually kind of forming the social glue between you and business partners, colleagues, customers, clients from other cultures? Because what often happens is people think they need to learn the business version of the language, but then they go to the country, the actual meetings are either conducted in an international language, for example, English, or the technical language that they use for the actual business side is very, very similar between their own language and the target language. What they discover is that the challenging bit is the going out for dinner afterwards, where people are making social small talk. And so actually they need a far more general understanding and knowledge of the language than they first thought. Once you've analysed your needs and your motivation and your reason for learning the language, you need to then kind of stick strongly to that, because lots of course material, lots of apps, lots of teachers will try this one-size-fits-all approach and teach you stuff that actually you don't need. And again, it's not that you don't need it and will never need it, it's that it isn't an immediate priority. And it's a bit like my buffet analogy, that you don't want to start with lists of animals if you're not going to the country to be a zookeeper. Eventually you might see an animal and you can always look it up or say to someone, how do you say that? Lots of course materials, unfortunately, even today, will be based on the idea that, some language is more difficult than other, and, some bits of grammar are more challenging, and therefore you need to start with the easy stuff and build your way up. I don't really believe there is easy stuff and hard stuff. But one of the results of this is that you get lessons that are built around the particular grammar they happen to have chosen to teach you. So in lots of languages, they'll start off with the simple present or its equivalent. And then the only thing that you can do with that is to talk about banal stuff like your daily routine, which frankly is of no interest to anyone.
Normalement, je me lève à 7h du matin. Je prends ma douche, je me sèche les cheveux et puis je m'habille. C'est-à-dire que je mets un slip, des chaussettes, un t-shirt ou une chemise, un pantalon et peut-être un pull s'il fait froid. Et puis je descends prendre le petit déjeuner.
Now my next point is something that lots of people disagree with, but personally, I find that learning lists of vocabulary is a waste of time. Now, the first reason for that is that language doesn't really make sense out of context. So you might learn, words for physical things, and they pretty much match it from one language to another. But once you start looking at more abstract concepts, you really have to understand how words are used within the context of the sentence or the situation. And you can only really do that by looking at dialogues and discourse in general. I have a theory that's kind of borne out by some of the research that I'm aware of, that there is a difference between language knowledge and knowledge about the world. Or what do you call it? Kind of episodic knowledge, I think it might be called. So, if you learn a list of words, my feeling is that goes into your knowledge about stuff. Yeah. So you can tell me that the English so you can tell me that the French for computer is ordinateur. In Chinese, it's dianao. And you could learn all of those off by heart, but when it actually came to saying the word, you wouldn't necessarily be able to think of it. And also, as someone who is slightly long in the tooth, I can tell you that from my experience, vocabulary that I have learnt in that way does not stay. Whereas words that I have learnt more organically, and I think in a more kind of linguistically authentic way, one, are easier to remember, and two, they stick there forever. So what do I mean by linguistically authentic way? One, if you're going to memorize anything, memorize phrases, because at least then you understand how the words in the phrases work and how they relate to each other. But my main recommendation for you on learning new items of vocabulary, new items of language, is to think, what do I want to be able to say, and then find out how to say it. Ideally, what do I want to be able to say, find out how to say it, and then say it. Or, I keep hearing this particular phrase, I wonder what it means, find out what it means, find out that it's interesting, and then again, it stays in your mind forever. Now, if you vehemently disagree with that, please let me know. Tell me about how you use various kinds of memorization techniques. But think about whether it is actually going into your linguistic memory or somewhere else. Unfortunately, the way that languages are traditionally taught suffers a lot from the fact that normally they lead to some kind of test. So that's where we get learning great lists of vocabulary from. And probably the biggest victim of this is grammar, because it's set up as being this really, really important thing that you can get wrong. And if you get it wrong, you lose points and you get big red marks. And we kind of set ourselves up that, if we make a grammar mistake, someone's going to laugh at us, they're going to think that we're stupid. And in fact, we really need to develop a much healthier attitude towards grammar. What are grammar rules for? Well, as a learner of a language, what a grammar rule should do is to help you say something or help you understand something. It's not about, some kind of great list of rules and regulations that you have to obey or something bad will happen to you.
Now, grammar isn't something you should fear. I mean, there's nothing wrong with making mistakes. It's not as if, balls of fire will rain down from the sky if you say something wrong. Or is it wrongly?
So my final word about grammar is as follows. If you find a really simple, easy to understand, short, concise rule that works for you and that tells you how to say something that you really want to say or understand things that you want to understand, then by all means learn it. If you come across things that are long and complicated, difficult to grasp, and have 25 exceptions, then leave them well alone. They're of no use to you. If you found this useful, give this video a like, drop a comment to let me know why or what else you would like to find out about. Click the subscribe button and have a look at one of these videos here. I'll see you next time, and thank you once again.